The unexpected war. The sky cracked open above the quiet town of Raylan's Reach. Dustin Kane was just a simple man, a mechanic, a wanderer. He fixed broken things, old machines, crashed satellites, lost tech from the stars. His workshop sat at the edge of the canyon, far from the chaos of cities and politics. He liked it that way. But on that day, the sky screamed. Bright fire rained down. The silence was gone. Dustin dropped his tools as the air shook. He ran out of his workshop and looked up. A massive ship, alien, beautiful, and badly damaged, broke through the clouds. It was burning, trailing black smoke. Chunks of it fell off like dying birds. Then came the second ship, sleek, dark, and full of weapons. War. Dustin had seen battles before. The galaxy was never quiet for long, but never this close. Not here. Not where he lived. The first ship tried to land. It failed. It crashed hard into the canyon below, hidden by red dust and shattered rock. Then silence again. Dustin grabbed his old gear, his scanner, his medpack, and his blaster. He didn't care about sides, but he had learned something over the years. Where ships crash, people get hurt, and someone might need help. He climbed into his old hoverbike and sped toward the canyon. As he got closer, he saw the signs: broken trees, melted rocks, fire licking the edges of the land. The first ship lay like a wounded animal, smoking and silent. He climbed down from the bike and approached with caution. Then he heard it. A voice. Soft, weak, not in his language. But the translator chip behind his ear clicked and whirred. Help, please, my child. He froze. From behind the broken hull, a figure appeared. A woman. No, an alien, yes, but beautiful in a haunting way. Tall, regal, with skin like silver moonlight and eyes full of pain. She wore what was once a royal robe, now torn and burned. In her arms, a small girl, barely conscious, breathing faintly. Dustin didn't move at first. The woman dropped to her knees in front of him. Please, she whispered. Take me. Take her. Hide us. They will come. They will kill us both. Dustin stared, heart racing. What? Who are you? He asked. My name does not matter, she said, but I was a princess. Now I am nothing, just a mother. Her eyes searched his face. Take us. As anything. Slaves, servants, concubines, if your kind still takes those. But don't let them take my daughter. Behind them, far above, the second ship circled back. They had only minutes. Dustin's gut twisted. He hadn't signed up for this. He fixed machines, not people, not princesses, not war refugees. But he couldn't ignore her. He couldn't ignore the child. He looked into her eyes, full of fear and pride at the same time. He knew then she would die before she let them take the girl. And for some reason, he couldn't let that happen. Get on the bike, he said. She hesitated, then stood quickly and followed. She held the child close as they climbed on. They rode back through smoke and dust, the engines of the enemy ship growing louder in the distance. Behind them, the canyon exploded. The second ship had begun its hunt, but Dustin was already gone, and he had no idea what he had just brought into his quiet little world. Hunted from the skies. The hoverbike screamed through the narrow canyon trails as dust whipped around them. Dustin's heart pounded, not from fear, but from the weight of what he was doing. He had taken in a stranger, an alien princess, and a child. Now, they were being hunted. The little girl had stopped crying, but her breathing was still weak. The woman behind him held her tight, one hand wrapped around the girl, the other gripping Dustin's jacket like it was her last anchor to life. Overhead, the second ship passed again. They're scanning for energy signatures, she said into his ear. They'll find us if we don't hide soon. Working on it, Dustin replied. His workshop was too exposed now. They couldn't go back there. Not yet. But there was a place. An old mine tunnel, long abandoned, hidden under a dead hill north of the ridge. He had used it before to hide damaged tech from raiders. He turned sharply, taking the back trail. "Who are they?" he shouted over the wind. She didn't answer right away. "They were my guards," she finally said. "Now they are hunters. After the Empire fell, everyone turned on each other. Power became the only law." "And your people?" "Dead," she whispered. Dustin didn't ask more. He didn't need to. He had seen that story before, on a dozen worlds. It always ended the same way. Smoke, blood, betrayal. He reached the hill and drove straight toward the cliff wall. At the last second, he slammed a hidden button on his wristband. A shimmer of light rippled over the rocks, and a metal door slid open just enough for the bike to squeeze through. Inside, darkness swallowed them. He parked the bike and helped the woman down. Her legs were shaking, but she refused to fall. Dustin took the child from her arms. She was light, too light. "She needs help," the woman said. "She hasn't eaten. She has fever." Dustin laid the girl down on a soft cot he kept in the corner. He opened his medkit, scanned the child, and injected her with a nutrient pack. Her small chest rose and fell. "She'll need rest. And more food." "I can serve you," the princess said suddenly. "I can clean, cook, anything. Please, let us stay." Dustin looked at her, confused, maybe even angry. "I'm not taking you as a servant. I didn't bring you here for that." "Then why?" she asked, her voice tight with emotion. He hesitated. "I don't know," he said. "But I couldn't let them take you. That's enough for now." For a moment, she stared at him like she didn't understand. Then she bowed her head. "You're different," she whispered. Suddenly, the tunnel shook. Dustin's eyes narrowed. He moved to the entrance, flicking on a small screen connected to outside sensors. A drone hovered above the ridge. Its red light blinked. It had found something. "They'll be here soon," he said. "We need to make this place look like it's been empty for years." Together, they moved fast. Dustin shut down all active tech. He spread dust over the floor to cover fresh footprints. The woman helped, pulling cloth over the girl and hiding the gear. Then they waited. Moments later, heavy footsteps echoed above. Dustin held his blaster. He gave the woman a silent look. She nodded, holding the girl close and quiet. A soft hissing noise followed. Then voices, in a sharp, alien tongue. They were searching. Breathing slowed. Dustin kept still, his finger on the trigger. One wrong sound, and it would all end. After what felt like hours, but was really just minutes, the noise faded. The hunters moved on. Silence returned. Dustin exhaled, finally. The woman looked at him, a strange expression in her eyes, part respect, part fear, part something he couldn't name. He sat down, exhausted. "You said your name doesn't matter," he said, "but I need to call you something." She hesitated. "My true name is long and royal," she said, "but you can call me Sarah." He nodded. "I'm Dustin." She gave a slow nod in return. "Thank you, Dustin, for not asking what I would have given, if you had asked." He didn't reply. He just looked at the small girl sleeping in peace for the first time in who knows how long. Outside, the hunters were still out there. And the real danger was only just beginning. The princess without a throne. For the first time in days, Sarah let herself sleep. Not deeply, not fully, but just enough to dream. Of stars, of palace halls, of a time when she was more than a fugitive mother hiding in dirt and darkness. Her daughter, Ari, slept beside her on a cot, covered in a worn blanket Dustin had found. The air in the hidden cave was cold and still. Every sound echoed, but at least they were alive. Dustin stood near the entrance, adjusting the scanners in silent mode. He hadn't slept yet. He kept glancing back at the two, at Sarah and the little girl, as if still unsure what he'd done by helping them. He didn't regret it, But he didn't understand it either. When Sarah woke, her silver hair was messy, and her once glowing skin had dulled. But her eyes, they still held fire. "I should work," she said quietly. "You should rest," Dustin replied, without turning around. She stood anyway. "I need to feel useful. I don't want your kindness for free." He turned to face her. "This isn't a trade." Her eyes narrowed. "Then what is it? Tidy?" "No, just the right thing to do." That answer seemed to confuse her more than anything. She followed him toward the back corner where a small power core hummed. He had made a tiny cooking space using scraps and old tech. Sarah looked at it, then at him. "I once had 10 servants to prepare my tea," she said. Dustin smirked. "Now you have 1 broken kettle and a half-burned ration pack." She laughed softly. It was the first time he heard that sound from her. It caught him off guard. Sarah helped prepare the meal anyway. She moved like someone used to being graceful, but now forced to live simply. It wasn't pride. It was pain. A quiet loss she carried in every movement. As they ate, she finally spoke again. "My people are gone," she said. "The royal line. Wiped out. My guards betrayed me. We were trying to flee when they shot us down." Dustin listened. "I thought someone would still be loyal," she whispered. "But no one came. Not even the ones I fed, protected, raised from children. Only Ori mattered in the end." She looked at her daughter and gently touched her cheek. "She's the last of her kind," Sarah said. "Half royal, half child. Hunted." Dustin asked carefully, "Why do they want her so badly?" Sarah didn't answer right away. Then she said, "Because she holds a key. Not just a royal bloodline, but a genetic code tied to ancient machines, weapons, locked worlds." Dustin's heart sank. "So she's more than a princess." "She's a threat," Sarah said, "or a weapon, depending on who holds her." That explained everything. The hunters, the chase, the fear. And now, Dustin had them both hidden in his shelter. Suddenly, the walls felt thinner. "We'll move soon," he said. "Can't stay here forever." "Where will we go?" she asked. "I have a friend," he said. "Old smuggler, lives off-grid, owes me a favor. Will he take us?" "If I ask right," Dustin said. "But it won't be safe. Getting off this planet. It's not easy anymore." She nodded slowly. "I'll go anywhere," she whispered. "As long as she lives." That moment hung heavy between them. Then a beeping sound broke the silence. Dustin rushed to the scanner. 3 red dots appeared on the edge of the map, moving fast. Not drones. Not patrols. Trackers. "They're closing in," he said. "We've got less than 15 minutes." Sarah stood immediately. "We'll go." Dustin threw gear into his pack. Tools, medicine, heat pads for Ori. He passed Sarah a small plasma blade. "Do you know how to use it?" She ignited it with one flick, holding it perfectly balanced. "I was raised on palace etiquette and 10 years of war." They packed quickly, and Dustin lifted Ori into his arms. She stirred, murmured something in her own language, then rested against his chest. He looked at Sarah. "You ready to run?" "No," she said, "but I will." The metal door opened quietly, revealing the cold desert night. Stars blinked above them. Somewhere in the dark, their hunters waited. But they had no choice. With the child between them, they ran, not as mechanic and princess, but as survivors. And the stars didn't care who lived or died. Smoke over the sand. The desert night was sharp and full of whispers. Dustin ran across the cold sand, boots pounding against the dry earth. In his arms, the small alien child, Ori, slept with a strange peace. She didn't know they were being hunted. She didn't know that behind them, death was moving quickly. Sarah kept pace beside him. She didn't ask questions. She didn't slow down. Her robe fluttered behind her like a torn flag. She looked like a queen. But there was nothing royal about the way she ran. She was a mother now. That was all. Behind them, the hidden shelter exploded. The heat washed over their backs. Dustin didn't turn around. He didn't need to. He knew what it meant. They'd been found. His bike had been destroyed. His tools, his scanner, his home, gone in one blast. Now it was just them, on foot, in the open. Keep heading east, he told Sarah. There's a ridge up ahead. With luck, we'll lose them in the rocks. If they have scent trackers, it won't matter. Let's hope they don't. They reached the ridge just as the sky behind them filled with red lights. The hunter ship dropped lower, scanning the ground. They ducked into a shallow cave. Sarah pressed herself against the wall, breathing hard. Her body trembled, not from fear, but from how long she had pushed herself without rest. She looked at Ari in Dustin's arms. She's getting colder, she whispered. She's not used to this atmosphere. Dustin pulled off his jacket and wrapped it around the girl. She'll be warm, he said. We'll make it. Sarah watched him. You're not like the men I knew, she said softly. He glanced at her. Better or worse? She didn't answer right away. Better, but harder to understand. The wind howled outside. Dust swirled in the cave mouth. The scanner on Dustin's wrist buzzed once, then twice. Something was close. Too close. He turned to Sarah. We can't stay here. If they get within 30 meters, we're visible to their thermals. He pulled out a small grenade-shaped device and threw it deeper into the cave. It activated with a click, sending out false heat signals. A decoy. Follow me, Dustin said. We're moving again. They climbed out the far end of the cave and entered a narrow ravine. It twisted like a snake, cutting between tall cliffs. The terrain was rough, but it gave them cover. Dustin stopped once to check a buried beacon he had hidden there long ago, just in case. It still worked. He sent out a silent signal, a single word, help. Then he kept moving. Sarah noticed the action. Who are you calling? An old friend, he said. If he's still alive, he'll come. And if he's not, then we run faster. Hours passed like that, one foot after the other, climbing, ducking, hiding. Sometimes Dustin carried the girl. Sometimes Sarah did, but neither ever complained. They finally reached an old transport stop, half buried in sand, long forgotten. Metal rusted, antennas broken. Dustin moved quickly to the terminal, hot-wired the door open, and led them inside. It wasn't much, but it had a roof, walls, shelter. He laid Ori down and opened another medkit. She was sweating now, fever climbing. She's not stabilizing, he said. She needs home air, Sarah whispered. Our kind, we weaken fast on foreign planets. Dustin stared at the little girl. Her tiny hand gripped his finger, like she knew he was the only thing between her and the dark. I won't let her die. Sarah sat beside them. For the first time, her eyes shimmered with tears, but she quickly wiped them away. In my world, she said, people like you don't exist. Kindness is rare. Everyone wants something. I used to want nothing, Dustin said. Just peace, quiet, a life without war. He looked at her. Then you fell out of the sky. Before Sarah could reply, the terminal lights flickered. Something was coming. Dustin grabbed his blaster and went to the window. A ship, small, old, patched together, hovered above the dunes. It was ugly, but he smiled. That's him, he said. He came. The ship landed rough, throwing sand in every direction. The hatch opened. A tall, bearded man stepped out, with eyes like frost and a rifle slung over his back. Dustin, he said, voice gravel. Terrace, Dustin replied. I need a favor. The man looked at Sarah, then at the child, then back at Dustin. You always find trouble, don't you? Just tell me you still have your smuggler's routes. Terrace nodded slowly. I can get you off-world, he said, but there'll be a price. Dustin looked at Ari. I'll pay it. He didn't know what the cost would be yet, but he knew what he had to protect. The cost of freedom. Dustin stood between a sleeping child and a man who had once smuggled weapons through war zones. Terrace. He looked the same, older, maybe, but not softer. His ship was old junk, but it could still fly. And in this galaxy, that made it more valuable than gold. You want me to move a royal fugitive and her daughter off a military-locked planet? Terrace asked, squinting at Dustin. That's not a favor. That's suicide. Dustin didn't flinch. She's not asking you. I am. Terrace looked again at the princess, now watching silently from the shadows. Even tired and covered in dust, Sarah carried herself like someone who once had people kneel before her. She got a bounty? He asked. Probably, Dustin replied. Maybe more than one. Then I need more than just your good word. Dustin reached into his coat and pulled out a tiny case, metal, old, and marked with a strange symbol. He tossed it to Terrace. The smuggler opened it. Inside were 5 thin rods. Energy keys. Ancient tech. Each one could buy a ship, a city, or even a new identity. Terrace blinked. Where the hell did you get these? Salvaged a wreck years ago, Dustin said. Never used them. You can have all 5. Terrace stared at him. Just for them? No, Dustin said. For all of us. Terrace looked at the girl. At Sarah. At Dustin again. Fine, he said at last. We leave tonight. But if that ship above us spots my takeoff signature, we're dead before we reach the clouds. I'll deal with it, Dustin said. Sarah stepped forward now, her eyes locked on Terrace. You'll protect her? Terrace nodded. She'll have a new name, new ID. No one will trace her. Good, Sarah said softly. Dustin looked at her. You mean you too? But Sarah didn't answer. She was staring at her daughter like it might be the last time. Later, after the plan was set, Dustin climbed the hill beside the old outpost. From there, he could see the stars. The hunter ship was still hovering in the distance, watching, waiting. He sat on a rock, silent. Sarah joined him a few minutes later. You were never a soldier, she said quietly. No, but you move like one, think like one. I've seen enough war to learn. She sat beside him, close, not touching, just near enough to feel the heat from his shoulder. You should have left us, she whispered. Maybe. Why didn't you? He looked at her. The wind tugged at her hair. Her eyes glowed faintly in the starlight. I don't know, he said. But when I saw you kneel, when you begged, it didn't feel right. It was shameful, she said. No, he replied. It was brave. She turned her face away, trying to hide something. I was raised to believe humans were crude, she said. Barbaric. Unworthy. And now, I think, you might be the only reason she's still breathing. Dustin didn't speak after that. Words felt too small. Back at the outpost, Terrace prepped his ship. The engines purred, low and quiet. Every sound was watched. Every movement planned. The escape had to be perfect. Terrace would take Sarah and Ari. He would use his codes to bypass the patrol ring. Dustin would stay behind and do the hard part. He would be the distraction. That wasn't the plan at first, but Dustin had changed it without telling them. He knew the hunter ship would chase any heat trail leaving the zone, so he'd give them one, loud and full of fire. Sarah stepped onto the ramp, holding Ari wrapped in blankets. The girl stirred weakly, blinking at the lights. Dustin placed a soft kiss on her forehead, then turned to Sarah. You'll be safe, he said. What about you? He forced a smile. I've dodged worse. She didn't smile back. I was wrong, she said suddenly. About what? You are not hard to understand. You're just good. And I forgot what that looked like. He didn't know what to say. So she stepped forward and placed her forehead gently against his, a quiet goodbye in her culture. A thank you. Then she stepped back, holding Ori close. The hatch closed. The ship rose, slow, careful, like a ghost. It slipped into the night without a sound. Dustin turned toward the ridge. The hunter ship had noticed. It changed course. He ran. Straight into their sight. Straight into danger. So they would never look back. One man against the sky. The night exploded behind him. Dustin didn't stop running. The hunter ship had locked onto him the second he showed himself. It swooped down like a hawk, black and sharp, scanning for every heat signature, every sound. And Dustin gave it exactly what it wanted. Movement, noise, a target. He sprinted across the sand flats, throwing flares and heat bombs behind him, making his trail impossible to ignore. Fire lit up the sky in orange streaks. The ship followed, engines roaring, chasing the bait. Terrace's ship was already out of sight. Good. That meant they were safe. Dustin kept moving, heading toward the old junkyard ruins in the Badlands, miles of collapsed metal towers and dead machines, a perfect place to vanish, or to die. He dove into a rusted crawl space, breathing hard. His heart thudded like a drum in his ears. The ship passed overhead, scanning the debris field. He didn't move. Not yet. Inside his coat, the pulse beacon blinked. That was the second part of his plan. A spike of false data, encrypted to mimic alien energy. He activated it. The hunter ship stopped. It hovered. Then it shifted direction, floating toward the far side of the junkyard, exactly where he wanted it. Dustin climbed out and began circling. Quiet. Far above the planet, Terrace's ship broke orbit. In the passenger cabin, Sarah held Uri close, wrapped in blankets. The child slept peacefully now, her fever cooling. The change in air had helped. The medicine Dustin gave her was working. But Sarah couldn't rest. She stood by the window, staring at the stars. She knew what Dustin had done. She had seen it in his eyes. He never meant to leave with them. She clenched her fists. Her heart ached. This wasn't how it was supposed to end. Terrace stepped beside her. "He'll survive," the smuggler said quietly. "He's not the type to die easy." "I didn't even get to say goodbye," she whispered. "Maybe that's the point." She turned to him. "Take us back." Terrace blinked. "What?" "I said turn around." "You're out of your mind." "I'm not leaving him there." Terrace shook his head. "That ship was a military hunter. You think he bought you time just so you could waste it?" "I don't care what he wanted," Sarah said. Her voice was hard now. Cold. Like it used to be. "I don't owe you anything. You want those keys. Then take us back." Terrace stared at her. Then he sighed. "Fine," he said. "But if we die, I'm blaming you." Back on the planet, Dustin crawled out of the pit, bleeding, coughing, barely standing. His ship was gone, but his body was wrecked. He staggered across the metal wasteland. Each step felt heavier. Then he heard it, a sound in the sky. He looked up. A small ship, familiar shape. It landed nearby, kicking up dust. The hatch opened, and she stepped out. Sarah, with Ari in her arms. She ran to him. Dustin collapsed to his knees. "You came back," he said, voice cracking. "I never left," she whispered, kneeling beside him. She helped him up, holding his arm across her shoulders. Terrace stood by the ramp, grumbling. "You better be worth it, human." Dustin just laughed. And for the first time, it didn't hurt. They climbed aboard, together. 3 fugitives, 1 broken ship, and a chance to begin again. A name worth remembering. The ship hummed softly as it left the wounded planet behind. Stars stretched across the black sky, quiet and endless. For the first time in days, no one was chasing them. No one was scanning. No one was firing. Just silence. Peace. Dustin sat in the medbay, half-bandaged and barely upright. His left side was bruised. His right arm was stitched. But he was alive. Somehow. Across from him, Sarah sat with Ari on her lap. The child was finally breathing easy. Color had returned to her cheeks. She held Dustin's jacket in her small hands, hugging it like a soft toy. She wouldn't sleep without it, Sarah said quietly. Dustin gave a weak smile. She has good taste. Sarah looked at him. You nearly died, she said. You came back. I shouldn't have. But you did. She looked down at her daughter. I made a choice, maybe the first real one in my life. Terrace walked in, chewing on some dried ration, and looking annoyed. We'll reach a neutral port in 6 hours, he said. No questions asked. I know someone there who can forge new IDs. Ari will disappear, safe, untouched. And the both of you? Dustin asked. Terrace raised an eyebrow. You'll have to decide that for yourselves. Then he left them alone again. Sarah leaned back slowly. I used to rule people with just my voice, she said. Now I feel more like a person than I ever did in a palace. Dustin nodded. Royal titles don't mean much when the world burns. No, but names still do. She looked at him closely now. Back then, when I begged you, I thought I had lost everything. My name, my pride, my meaning. You still had her, he said, nodding at Ari. Yes, but I had forgotten who I was. She shifted gently. In my people's tradition, when someone saves your life, not out of power or debt, but pure choice, you give them a name. Dustin chuckled. I've already got one. Not for you. For me. He blinked. I want you to name me, she said. He looked at her, surprised. Why? Because my past name is tied to blood and betrayal. But whatever name you give me, that will be mine. Chosen. Earned. Dustin thought for a moment. Then softly, he said, Lyra. Her eyes widened a little. That's a star. One that never stops shining, he said, even in the darkest sky. Sarah, no, Lyra, closed her eyes and smiled. That name felt lighter, brighter, like it belonged to someone who could start again. 6 hours later, they arrived at the port. It was a floating city built into an asteroid field. Shifting platforms, blinking lights, ships from 100 systems all docking and leaving. It was chaos and freedom rolled into one. Terrace got them through security. Inside, his contact handed over 3 ID chips. Fake names, clean records, no ties to any empire, royal line, or hunted past. I even gave the kid a school record, the man said, grinning. You're just another family now. Dustin looked at the word on the file. Family. That word hit harder than he expected. Later, in a small rented cabin above the port's edge, Dustin stood at the window. Lyra joined him. She's sleeping, she said, dreaming without fear. That's what kids should do. Lyra watched the stars. You could leave, she said suddenly. Now, go anywhere. I know. But you're still here. Dustin looked at her. So are you. They stood quietly for a moment. Then Lyra reached out and took his hand. Not with urgency. Not with fear. Just trust. We don't owe each other anything anymore, she whispered. I know. But I don't want to forget what you gave us. He looked down at her hand in his. I won't forget either. The stars outside blinked. Ari slept peacefully in the next room. No titles. No crowns. Just a mother, a child, and the man who chose them, when no one else did. And somewhere deep in the galaxy, people would still whisper stories of a fallen princess who begged for mercy, and the human who gave her something greater. A second chance.